Kia ora, I'm Raqi Syed, and welcome to the Spotlight Lecture. I'm a senior lecturer at the School of Design and program director of the Master of Design Technology degree.
Yep, and I'm Missy Molloy, and I'm a senior lecturer in the film program, and I'm also the program director. So we often work closely together as our interests are quite aligned.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Our format today is I will speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'll hand over to Missy, and Missy will present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have another 20 minutes to have a discussion with you all. And hopefully you'll have some questions and thoughts, and you can just type them into the chat function on Zoom, and we will field the discussion from there. Great. So today's discussion is titled Racial Dimensions of Screen Aesthetics. And to set us up, I'd like to offer some working definitions of some of the terms I'm going to be using in this talk. Scholars like Angela Davis and Ibram X. Kendi urge us to make a distinction between the idea of not a racist and anti-racist. Not a racist has historically been understood as a personal stance that has been used as a form of denial, particularly when justifying racism through policy, science, religion, etc. Anti-racist is an active, ongoing pursuit which goes beyond personal beliefs and focuses on systemic, structural, and legislative policies and practices that enable racism. Anti-racist is not a solution, it's a work in progress. I can't really define aesthetics because it's an entire branch of philosophy that addresses beauty, the sublime, meaning, so basically everything. But for our purposes, it's about how we define constructs of beauty, which emerged in the 15th century Europe, in the 15th century European context, and more specifically beauty lighting, which allows us to consider the technologies, materials, shading, and rendering related to realistic representations of the human face. Critical aesthetics means we don't have to first have a discussion about Plato, Kant, and Nietzsche. We can instead question and critique standards of beauty that have been established in the context of Renaissance portraiture. For our purposes, I will focus on self-portraiture, and we'll see why this matters. When I say anti-racist critical aesthetics, I mean first to recognize the historic patterns and practices of racism in regards to the realistic representation of the human face, which we consider the creation of beauty. And second, to interrupt these patterns and dismantle these practices. So why are we talking about all this old stuff? Shouldn't we be talking about computers and technology? From a light and material and shading perspective, technical artists will recognize the relationship between these two images. But let's go a little bit deeper. One of the reasons why I find the comparison of Renaissance painting to visual effects to be so compelling is that, like the discourse of VFX, painting at this time was a tension between craftsmanship and artistry. There were arguments on either side, and what was at stake was the role of and the significance of painters themselves. Were portrait painters visionary creatives, or were they just there to execute the vision of wealthy patrons? I'm also interested in the word effects, what it means and when it came into common usage. During the antiquities, the term effects was used by Aristotle to describe the practice or technique or art, which involved bodily labor. Aristotle believed that this bodily labor was used to create effects and should be preserved for slaves and craftspeople. So this sets up a discourse of disciplines for a very long time, which is that privileged men had thoughts and slaves and craftspeople made things. The art historian Pamela Smith writes that it's only when effects were combined with science in the 16th century that effects, or rather art, came to be understood as the production of knowledge. Around this time, when science transforms effects into art, another important thing happens. The most significant treatise of the Renaissance was published. In the middle of the 16th century, a painter named Giorgio Vasari writes a book about the artists of the Renaissance. This book establishes the legend of painters like Michelangelo. And we can understand Vasari as the original hype man. Without this book, the reputation and rock star status of Renaissance painters would not have been known to the general public. Lives isn't exactly a scholarly work. Vasari mostly wrote about his friends and people he admired. Where he lacked facts, he made things up. Nevertheless, Lives has become an important historic document. The point I want to make here is that the Renaissance wasn't just a time of great experimentation and discovery for art, science, and technology. It was also a time when the role of the artist as a public figure and storyteller was established. Since the antiquities, the labor of art had been the domain of slaves and craftspeople, but we now understood it to be the profession of a group of elite people. And by we, I don't just mean we artists and people who are invested in art, but significantly also the general public. But who exactly were these artists? I'm going to focus now on a subset of these elite artists, specifically the artists who painted their own image, because it's through their work that we can understand and imagine the embodied experience of being an artist and the production of art. In the context of the Renaissance self-portrait, I want to ask some questions. What is the role of the artist, and who gets to be an artist? Many of you may be familiar with this painting. As recently as late 2020, the New York Times ran an interactive essay about its significance. This is Albrecht Dürer painting himself in the 16th century, and it is, we are to understand, the myth on which every selfie stands. An image so detailed it appeared as divine creation. Dürer was known then and now as an entrepreneur of new media. It is, some people believe, the greatest self-portrait ever painted, and it's arrogant and fetishistic in its detail. The skin, the hair, the cloth, the fur, everything is mathematically accurate, including the perspective, the veins of the hand, the reflection that we see in his eyes. And this is the language of visual effects as well. We see Dürer here as a man who is worthy of being depicted. And this is just one of many moments in which race, class, and gender are encoded into the subject matter of the artist's story. We know, for example, that women did paint their own portraits at this time, but that history isn't well circulated. These are all the self-portraits of Renaissance women painters that have so far been uncovered. For example, Sofonisba Anguissola and Artemisia Gentileschi's biographies have had to be recovered very slowly. In the category of Renaissance self-portraiture, I have uncovered only 2 people of color. And here the ancestry is uncertain, though scholars have made cases for the African ancestry of both of these artists. On the left, we have Francesco Torbido Il Moro, suggesting he was a Moor of Indian or Ethiopian descent. And on the right, we have sculptor Andrea Briosco Riccio, Riccio being Italian for hedgehog, and likely a reference to his curly hair. The historian Kim Hall has noted that in Renaissance England, for example, Black was not so much the opposite of white, but rather the opposite of beautiful and fair. Hall says that it's a peculiarity of the English language that beauty and blondness are the same word. This was not necessarily the case for other European languages. And because race was not understood as a labeling device at this time, the appearance of skin color was the primary vehicle for otherness. It's no surprise, therefore, that the identity of Black painters during this period is uncertain. So if we go back to that long list of painters Vasari cataloged now, the great painters, we do see 3 women. We see again Sofonisba Anguissola, Plautia Nelli, and Properzia de Rossi. Francesco Torbido, the Moor, also made the cut, but everyone else here is a European man. A lot happens in the next 300 years, but the ideas around the great painter and the value applied to their work doesn't change that much. If we fast forward to the late 20th century and look at the digital human, I want to ask some questions that we've already asked. What is the role of the digital human, and who gets to be a digital human? What we see in the first few waves of digital human, or rather the first wave, is a kind of portraiture that emerges from the tradition of Dur. Technologists and actors who are interested in using technology to tell their stories, people like Marlon Brando on the top left, Andy Serkis, Mike Seymour, Doug Robles, are all turned into digital humans. And if you haven't seen Doug Robles's talk, Doug Robles is on the bottom left-hand corner. It's really fascinating. He does a TED talk where he wears a facial motion capture suit while he's on stage, and he talks about the technology of the digital human while performing the digital human. And it's a really fascinating kind of insight into this process about the embodiment of the digital human at this moment when it was made. Vincent, who's on the top left there, was made by a Korean team, 5 men at a studio called Giant Step. But all of the skin shaders and technology to create Vincent was actually modeled on the characters and skin shading of Meet Mike, who sits directly below him. So it's easy to see here how the research and technology on creating the likeness of white men begets more white men. In the last few years, we see what I call the second wave of digital humans. And the kind of person who can be a digital human has started to shift. We see more diverse faces, but these digital humans do not speak for themselves. These digital humans perform, but their technology and purpose is explained to us by the white men who made them. We see in the way, for example, Micah, who's at the top left, and she's like an influencer, was made by Isaac Bratzel of Brood Studio. There's Siren, who's on the bottom left, on the bottom right, Senua, and even Will Smith's digital human, digital double, are showcased at tech conferences. But the visual effects supervisors, we are to understand, who made them, talk about them as a kind of blank canvas, telling us what digital humans can do and what their purpose is. The likeness of Siren, for example, is based on a real Chinese actor, a woman named Binji Zhang. But Binji herself never speaks or performs Siren. She is only presented to us through the interpretation of the men who make her technology. And now we have Epic's MetaHuman platform as our sort of not final, but third and current wave of digital humans. And there's an opportunity here. Both scholars Ted Kim and Jim Malazita have talked in detail about how subsurface modeling, specularity, and metalness, which are technologies that are incorporated into skin shading, intervene with the accurate modeling of Black skin on the 001 metahuman model, as she is known on the left-hand side, the Black woman. More specifically, how motion, and so I worry about our inability to talk about the performance of race that's happening. So these two characters, the original 2 metahumans that were published, were released as part of Epic's early access on the MetaHuman platform. And they became the characters that the first, tech artists around the world started experimenting with to understand how easy to use and accessible this technology was. So during that process and since, I worry about our inability to talk about the performance of race that is happening here with these characters. More specifically, how motion capture technology facilitates and enables the performance of race and digital blackface. We're at the other end of the spectrum now, where these digital humans are presented not as embodied actors and people who take ownership of their technology and can talk about their presence, but as empty vessels, or rather a kind of blank canvas. But there is another way to think about portraits. And this is a portrait that many of you may be familiar with, Night in the Fare from 1912. It's a portrait of Ina Te Papatahi. And Ina sat for C.F. Goldie, the painter, many times and was a descendant of Maori chiefs who signed the Treaty of Waitangi. Portraits can be complicated. Here in New Zealand, we have a series of paintings by C.F. Goldie, who was known as a colonial painter. And these arise out of the same tradition of European painting as we saw with the Durer self-portrait. So C.F. Goldie would have trained in the salons of Europe and understood these techniques, but we can understand them differently. They function in a context of co-production. Goldie had a number of important Maori historical figures who sat for his portraits, and these images were designed and crafted through mutual agreement. And if you look at the research and writings of Roger Blackley, the New Zealand art historian, he's written extensively about this process. In New Zealand, we understand these portraits not as an art object, but as tonga, which means treasured possession, but also artifacts and war booty. And the place of these portraits is uneasy, right? It's all of these things, but it approaches a more equitable way of producing and spectating, looking at, experiencing the human likeness. The nuance brought about by co-production between author and subject, combined with the emotional, combined with the embodied perspective of the artist practicing self-portraiture is, I believe, a way to bring us closer to what we can all agree we want more of, which is better stories. In my lighting and rendering class here at Victoria University, at the School of Design, we've been experimenting with these ideas. And in the first year that I ran this course, in order to teach lighting, we used generic digital humans that we purchased on the marketplace. And the results were fine, they were acceptable. Students learned how to light, they understood the technology and the craft. But what I found is that the outcomes didn't sing, they weren't special, they weren't interesting, they didn't tell stories. They were just kind of like exercises in understanding technology. And so what we started doing is having the students go through this process and create and craft and build their own digital humans of themselves. And what I found is in doing that, there's a level of care and storytelling that emerges when artists learn the principles of lighting through self-portraiture. The designer, Dr. Dori Tunstall, has a name for this. She calls it respectful design. Respectful design is about designing ourselves into our environment so that we can design and problem solve from the inside out rather than approaching a design problem from the outside and imagining solutions for a speculative user group or a speculative perspective. And so here again is more examples of the work that's produced by my students in our graduate class. Thank you so much. I am now going to turn over to Missy Molloy, who's going to carry on this discussion.
Raqi, you're so good with the time. Ready. So I'm shifting gears radically. I hope that's not too awkward. I'm presenting research from a chapter that I wrote a couple of years ago, actually, about Top of the Lake China Girl, which is the second season of Jane Campion's successful television program, the only one she's made so far. This chapter came out last month. I'm presenting research from the chapter, but I'm also kind of taking a point that I raised in the conclusion of the chapter, or that came up as a subclaim throughout the chapter. And I'm taking that and kind of delving more deeply into it. Because as you can tell from the title of the chapter, which was Fetal Imagery and Alternative Maternities in Jane Campion's Top of the Lake, I was focusing on images, not only of fetuses in the series, but also of infants and babies who feature kind of prominently in the series. And my thesis statement for the chapter is on the slide here. The chapter reads China Girl as the culmination of Jane Campion's career-long attention to the convolutions of the mother-daughter bond, and Top of the Lake as a whole as confirmation of Campion's status as the contemporary screen author most committed to the peculiar complexities of motherhood, which Top of the Lake closely scrutinizes through portraits of alternative maternities, including early teen pregnancy, adoption, and surrogacy. Oh, and the cover of the book is there on the left. So I wanted to present some of the material from the chapter that has to do with my reading of the feminist aesthetics. And in my view, the feminist aesthetics are rooted in the series' treatment of maternity as a fairly complex, subjective state of mind, and also diverse portraits of maternity that the series provides. But I also wanted to ask this question, which I kind of circled back to in the conclusion of the chapter. Do women of color have a place in Jane Campion's celebrated screen feminism? And I'm using Top of the Lake to answer that question, or at least provide some preliminary hypotheses. So I will cover some of the points in the chapter, but I'll also cover aesthetic and narrative functions of one of the major characters in Top of the Lake China Girl is the first victim in the series. So she's called China Girl by the police and the coroner when they first discover the body, because they can't ID her. And it turns out that she's a sex worker and surrogate, and she's originally from Thailand. And it takes them until the 5th episode of the series before we get like her actual name. So initially she's referred to as China Girl, and later she's referred to as Cinnamon. And then at the very end, we get her given name, which is Padma. So I'll talk a little bit about how she functions in the series. And I'll also talk about how the other Asian sex workers who are surrogates as well, how they function in the series. And that's in order to come to some preliminary conclusions about women of color in the feminist aesthetics of China Girl. I just wanted to give a little bit of background about the series protagonist. And the reason is because this presentation makes a lot more sense to people who have seen at least one of the seasons, but especially the second season of Top of the Lake. But the main character is played by Elizabeth Moss. So a lot of people are familiar with her. So I'll just put her face up on the screen. But she's the series protagonist. And she's a police detective. And in the first season, she travels home to the South Island of New Zealand, to an area around Glenorchy and Queenstown, because her mother is terminally ill with cancer, and she ends up involved in a case that's that deals with rape and rape-related pregnancy. And in the second season, she's only recently returned to Sydney, and here she's working on a case that deals with the reproductive black market. And like a lot of crime drama in kind of peak prestige television era, her cases each season align uncannily with her personal life and traumas. So the crime that she deals with is usually highly relevant to a trauma or a psychological struggle that she's facing. And in addition to that kind of thematic alignment between the crime and her personal life, we also usually discover that she's even more personally connected, like literal connection. So in the first series, the first kind of villain character, he turns out to be her father, but she didn't know that. And in the second season, she becomes acquainted with the daughter she gave birth to in her teens, who she put up for adoption. She becomes acquainted with her, and her daughter is intricately woven into this surrogacy reproductive black market scheme. So you can see that the personal and the professional are really tightly linked in the series. So in the chapter, I read the feminist aesthetic as hinging on maternal ambivalence. So I see a lot of productive potential in the series, and China Girl specifically, in the way it kind of represents maternal suffering as cyclical and reproductive, and it shows its intensity is amplified by women's subordinate status in patriarchal societies. In an article that was published around the time of China Girl's release, Jane Campion made this statement when she was discussing China Girl. She said, this whole area of female experience, and she's referring to maternal desire, ambivalence, trauma, and loss, is so unknown, but it's like the equivalent of going to war, except no one makes movies about it. And so this is the area that I was especially interested in, how the series delved into these experiences of maternity. So in second season, it's dealing a lot with women who are having severe difficulties getting pregnant, and that they go through IVF 9 times, and they spend a lot of money. They put their houses, they mortgage their houses. So it's about this desperation to be pregnant that drives the reproductive industry, and that therefore gives rise to this black market. And I found that the series treatment of the intensity of the desire to be a mother, and also the intense experiences that mothers have, I felt that this was unique and feminist. So I put a little line from the chapter: China Girl's casting of maternity in a criminal light aligns with Campion's view of women's experiences as mothers, lovers, and daughters as dangerously intense and spectacularly transgressive. So to me, the aesthetics of mothers and of babies and of fetuses registers this kind of transgression and dangerous intensity. And earlier in Campion's career, I think that the focus was more on women characters struggling in patriarchal societies for personal and artistic and creative kind of autonomy and recognition. So this shifts to a focus on maternity, in my view, in the crime genre. So some of the images that I kind of highlight have to do with these really striking sequences in which the subjective experiences of the mothers, including Robin, are rendered in these surreal, with surreal imagery that gets at the strangeness of their experiences of motherhood. So China Girl throughout, so these sequences are sprinkled throughout the episodes, but it's consistently reiterating maternal desire as dangerously intense to the extent that mothers are singularly vulnerable to suffering and even psychosis. This image might be a little more difficult for you to see because it's, oh wait, let me explain this one quickly. So in this one, Robin this is her in the middle of the night suffering from a kind of episode where she's having difficulty determining reality from her own kind of imagination. And she's imagining kind of outlines of herself at earlier ages with different aged infant figures. And she's kind of like nurturing them at different stages of development. And this is a kind of dream sequence, and it ends in her screaming in terror and kind of ambiguous suffering. So Robin's not the only character who has these kind of experiences in the series. One of the mothers who is part of the surrogacy scheme, so she's paid a surrogate, which is illegal. There's no commercial surrogacy allowed in Australia. She's paid a surrogate to kind of carry her child. She loses touch with the surrogate, and then she becomes extremely anxious to the extent that she's put into a mental institution. So it kind of animates in a surreal sequence her experience. And in this image, she's wandering around looking for her baby and in terror and saying that she can't find it. And the infant is kind of this very strange creature that's definitely not designed to look cuddly or kind of cute in any sort of familiar and conventional infant imagery sense. So it's a gaunt and a horrifying infant to kind of complement her experience in that moment. So my conclusion was that these striking images, that they're compelling, they're disturbing, they're otherworldly, they emphatically express the ambivalence many mothers experience. So a lot of times their faces the actresses' faces will register very conflicting emotions. So usually it's something like rapture combined with dread. And here is where I see feminist potential in the rendition of maternity that's not quite comfortable or idealized in any sense. And in this particular episode, she's kind of getting dressed for work, and she's holding two tiny, perfectly formed babies in her palms. So in the course of kind of delving into the representation of mothers in this second series, which is focused on the reproductive Black market, I came to the conclusions that I pasted in on the right, which was there was a strange disconnect between the attention paid to the wealthy white mothers who were implicated in the surrogacy scheme and the women who provided their bodies to make the surrogacy work, to make it run. And I thought that this was particular or initially striking in the lack of emphasis on China Girl herself, the fact that we don't get very much information about her and that her characterization is quite thin. And then as I continued on in that track, I decided to analyze the overall kind of depiction of the other sex workers who live in the same brothel where Cinnamon had lived before her death, and then who are also serving as surrogates. So to me, it was striking how there was that inequality between the kind of attention to the characterizations. So to me, this signaled some kind of weakness because the series is trying to represent the fact that these crimes are linked, that the desperate desire for maternity on the part of the clients of the surrogacy scheme, that it links them really intimately with the women providing the service, the surrogates. And yet most of the depth of the series' attention is on the wealthier white women. So I wanted to give you a better sense of how the other characters do feature. You've seen a little bit of how Robin and Felicity are depicted with their subjective kind of experiences. I put an image of Robin on the left, and that's another illustration of kind of a close attention to her face in an experience of maternal intensity. She's enraptured by the sight of her daughter, who she gave up for adoption, who she hasn't seen in 16 or 17 years. She's also kind of has a bit of pain in her face. So that complexity is coming through in the expressions there. So at the time of the release, Jane Campion was asked multiple times to comment on the Asian themes. This is from a Variety article, and it says, regardless of whether you enjoy Top of the Lake China Girl, the provocative title in the series' racial makeup certainly raises eyebrows. While all the leads of the show are white, the China Girl herself, the victim of the crime at the center of the story, is a Thai immigrant. That was also true of the first season, which focused on Tui, a 12-year-old Asian preteen who walks into a lake after discovering she's pregnant. And I'll just note that Tui is actually in the first season, Tui is a New Zealander. She has a Thai immigrant mother and a Scottish immigrant father. So she's an Asian New Zealander. So a lot of the reviews and some of the scholarly writing on the series has drawn attention to this parallel. And I think it's interesting that if you compare the two, if you've seen the first season of Top of the Lake, Tui is actually a major character, and she's the top, she's listed as one of the key cast members. She's in the title sequence, and her character arc is kind of dynamic. She features pretty regularly in the episodes. In comparison, China Girls is strikingly thin, and we don't ever get that kind of sense that she's a major character. She seems more like an incidental, despite the fact that she's in the title. And I was struck by the fact that when Jane Campion was speaking about this, she says she thinks it is purposeful. And the title implies that she's going to explain the Asian themes, and yet it's kind of inconclusive, the article's coverage of that kind of explanation. And you can see it in the hesitation of her language. To me, it's interesting how both women are used as the inciting incidents for the plot. So they play a major role in moving the plot forward. And they also are key to this early aesthetic establishment of quite beautiful and compelling water imagery with their kind of superficial aspects of their physicality. So in the first season, we have a lot of images of Tui when she's going into the lake. And in the second season, we get the images of China Girl, Cinnamon Padma, who is already dead in these sequences. And she's in a green suitcase, and her hair, her black hair, is coming out of the suitcase. Okay, we still got some time. So this image that I have up here, it doesn't come to light until around episode 4 or 5. And this is a photograph that Robin and her partner Miranda discover at the home of one of Cinnamon's clients, a client who had frequently hired her for, what is it called? Oh, for girlfriend experiences. So he was a client who was like more invested in her personally than most of her clients. And he even considered them like in love. So we see this image of her late in the series. And then after this point, we begin to see her in imagined episodes from the perspective of Brett, that client, and he's imagining having sexual encounters with her. So in those sequences where that's the main place that she's actually features in the series, she's blatantly objectified. She's blatantly objectified to register her point of view of Brett. We don't get any kind of imaginary sequences from her perspective, which is interesting because that contrasts like the imaginary sequences I showed you from Robin and Felicity, and other characters have those throughout, but none of the Asian sex workers have those. So when I started to consider the way the other sex worker surrogates are featured, I noted that there was a tendency to have many of Asian sex worker characters that aren't really too well differentiated in the same shot. And they kind of move as a pack. They kind of lounge around perennially scantily clad. The series is emphasizing that the different social economic classes are parasitic, that they feed on each other. But like I said before, the effective and kind of psychological emphasis is on the clients, the older white women who are paying for that service, rather than on the younger Asian sex workers who are supplying that. So I give you another example of that kind of tendency to depict them as a pack. So I'm saying that they are sort of figuring as a single collective. There's not much individuation. There's a slight bit, which I might have the chance to touch on. This strongly contrasts the multidimensional characterizations of the affluent white women. And that includes Robin's partner in the case, who's Miranda, and she's played by Game of Thrones actress Gwendolyn Christie. So all the top cast in this series are the white affluent characters. A chapter that came out pretty quickly after the series premiered is called White Vulnerability and the Politics of Reproduction in Top of the Lake China Girl. They kind of presented this critique, which I kind of agree with. They said this about the series: it's an intense emotional drama about white women's experiences of sexual violence, reproduction, and motherhood. The affective economy of the series attaches great value to white femininity as precious, emotionally fragile, and at risk of abuse against the flat backdrop of passive and emotionally indifferent Asian sex workers. And that's a pretty strong indictment of the series. I think it's maybe a little more complicated than that, though I do on the whole agree with what they're saying there. So I'm gonna give you a little, before I wrap up and draw a couple of conclusions, I wanted to give you a little bit of a direct taste of the way this works in the editing and the kind of imagery of the series. So in the second episode, Robin and Miranda first they visit with a sex worker collective, and they speak with this woman, Linda, who represents the sex worker collective, because they're trying to get help IDing China Girl at that point. They have difficulty doing that. While Linda explains typical student visa, false passport scenarios, she provocatively states, "We all look the same to you." After she says that, Miranda leans forward and says, "Do we all look the same to you?" In reply, Linda laughs dismissively. That ends that scene. And then we cut to Linda, kind of a montage sequence in which Linda leads Robin and Miranda around, kind of on a tour of different brothels, where they ask questions to see whether they can figure out which brothel Cinnamon came from and who she exactly was. So it does make sense narratively for us to be in the perspective of Robin as the protagonist and as the detective on the case, kind of pursuing this line of inquiry. And yet these visits to the brothels, the way they're rendered with image and sound, it intensifies her status as like an outsider coming into an exotic and foreign terrain. And I isolated in particular the counter shot sequence, wherein we're kind of placed in the peeping Tom perspective of Robin, who's kind of like an uninvited and a stranger kind of coming into this space. And then when she looks at them, we get the look back, and it's again like a collective looking back at her, because at least 3 of them meet her gaze, 3 of the women on the bed. She doesn't speak with them, it just cuts. So to me, it intensifies this kind of enigmatic quality of the Asian sex workers' stories, and it suggests that their subjectivities, unlike the white women characters in the series, are impenetrable, because when they meet the white women characters like Felicity that are the other end of the reproductive Black market, we get a lot of information about their subjective experience, and we get those imaginary encounters from their point of views, and we don't get those, it's not reciprocated here. I did want to highlight that there is a character who gets has a speaking role and gets a bit more differentiation as the series progresses, and her name is Caramel, and she's in the middle there, played by Merlin Tong. But her characterization is mainly pretty one-dimensional. Like, for instance, when they go, there's a scene where they all go swimming together because the Mary, who's Robin's daughter, is concerned that that the sex workers don't get any opportunity to go out of the brothel enough. So she and Robin take them with her alongside her father. And in that scene, Caramel's like flirting with the father, but it's kind of like it has a mercenary quality to it, as a sort of a stereotype moment. There's not much more beyond that. So some of these conclusions that I drew when I started to analyze the way that Cinnamon and also the sex workers function seem to resonate in an interesting way with the title of the series, in combination with that promotional image you see there on the right. So in that Variety article that talks about the Asian themes in China Girl, they said that the dual meaning implies fetishized foreignness as well as fragility. And they talk about this poster, which shows Robin naked from the waist up with cracks running through her torso as if she is made of porcelain. And to me, it's really interesting to see the combination between the dual meaning of the title, which highlights the kind of incapacity of the white Australian characters to kind of even identify accurately Padma. It tailors that, or like tattoos that onto the white protagonist character to kind of bring to the surface that idea of women as uniquely fragile in patriarchal societies, which is one of the points that I think Jane Campion tends to make consistently with her work. So that kind of attention to women's vulnerability, their China-like aspect of them, it's transposed onto Robin, even though the other meaning of it is alluding to the main victim of the case. So to me, this kind of underscores that lack of equity in the attention to the different types of maternal suffering that the series actually addresses through the criminal emphasis on illegal surrogacy. And I think this is a strong contrast with the Top of the Lake season 1, which I think a lot more people have actually seen, in which there's a whole community of women of different ages and in different races to some extent. And they're kind of subverting patriarchal ideas of how women should or can function. And this series doesn't really have that kind of alternative and productive potential in the same way. Instead, it kind of magnifies the experiences of the white women characters to the detriment of the women who kind of carry that burden for them.
Thank you so much for joining us. It would be great to continue this discussion, but maybe we will see some of you all around town. It's Wellington after all, and we can talk more.
Thank you for coming.